Right then, hi everybody. In this video, I'm going to be talking through how to answer the questions on paper one. And in our case, paper one is about medicine in Britain and medicine on the Western Front. Okay, we're going to go through how to answer the questions, give you a few hints and tips and some sentence starters to get you going. So, question one is always describe two features of, and this will be something on the Western Front. Okay, something about medicine on the Western Front. The first part of the paper is always about medicine on the Western Front for us. So in this case, it says here, describe two features of the regimental aid posts. And obviously, you'll have done a bit of revision about what the regimental aid posts are for your exam, but you just have to simply identify a feature. So here's one that I've done. I've said they were usually located in the trenches, and that it can be as simple as that. But then to get a second mark, okay, you notice it's for 4 marks. Identify two features. For each feature, you need to explain them a little bit or describe them in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'm saying why they were usually in the trenches. This was because they were the first place that soldiers went for treatment on the Western Front. Okay, it just shows I know a little bit more about these regimental aid posts. Then I'm going to do the same again for another feature. They were staffed by one medical officer, and this person would decide who could be patched up and returned to the front and who needed further care, okay, or passed on further down the chain of evacuation. Okay, so here we can see feature one, a little bit more knowledge, feature two, a little bit more knowledge. Okay, pretty straightforward, those questions. It's just a case of doing the revision and knowing your stuff. Okay, this one's a bit more skills based, and it will always say study sources A and B. It will ask you how useful are sources A and B into an inquiry into something on the Western Front, something to do with medicine on the Western Front. In this case, we have health problems faced by soldiers in the trenches. So we need to be thinking when we're reading these sources. I think we're only going to look at A, but when we're reading the sources, we need to be bearing in mind this section of the question. Okay, the focus of the question, knowledge focus of the question. In this case, it's health problems faced by soldiers. Okay, so straight away when we see the source, we should be thinking, right, health problems. What health problems can we see here? Okay, and there's source B. We're not going to look at both of those, but I do want to look at source A. Just as a reminder, a source is useful if it gives us information that is relevant to our inquiry, and in this case, that is health problems faced by soldiers. So if it gives us information about health problems faced by soldiers that we think is going to be accurate, okay, that's what makes a useful source. So what information does this source provide to us, first and foremost? So we can see here from the image that it shows trench foot was an issue. We can see them being treated, and we can make the assumption that because it's their feet, we know that trench foot was an issue. So it must be trench foot there that they're working on. Okay, so it gives us some information about health problems. The nature of the source, and now we're going to test whether that information is accurate. The nature of the source is a picture. The origin of the source is from the time of the trenches. Okay, it's from 1918. And the purpose, we think, would be to show people that it was being treated, but we don't know. Okay, I'm making an assumption there. So is this source comprehensive? Does it give us everything we need to know? It doesn't give us a wide range of issues or problems or health problems, does it? So it just tells us about trench foot. So it's not particularly comprehensive, but we think it must be accurate because we've got a snapshot here of things how they were. But we know that for soldiers to get treated like this, it was probably uncommon. Okay, it was uncommon for soldiers to be treated like this, and I'll show you an answer to this question in a sec that might explain why. So, do these things make it useful? Well, yes, the fact that it gives us information does make it useful. The fact that it's a picture and we can see it makes it useful. It's from the time, okay. It's first hand. It's a primary source, so we can see it actually happening, what actually happened. Now, we don't know whether it's going to be useful or accurate based on the purpose, okay? If it's trying to show people that people are being treated Are they just doing that for show purposes, to keep morale up and all those sorts of things? It doesn't give us all health problems on the Western Front, so maybe not too useful in that sense. But because it's accurate and we think it might be accurate, then yes, that makes it useful. And if it's not typical, then no, it's not useful. But you need to explain that. Okay, so here is a model answer, and it's quite a long one actually. You maybe wouldn't need to write this much, but this is a sort of top grade answer. So say source A is useful because it shows us that trench foot was an issue in the trenches and that the army were aware of it. The source suggests this because we can see medics treating soldiers' feet. This is likely to be accurate, as I know that trench foot was a major issue. This was due to the extremely wet conditions in the trenches, especially at the 3rd Battle of Ypres, which was only a few months before this picture was taken. I'm using my knowledge there. Okay, I'm using my knowledge there to test the accuracy of the knowledge that's given, or the information that's given. The purpose of the source might be to persuade people at home that soldiers were being looked after. This makes me question the accuracy of the source. See here, I'm not saying that it's not accurate, but I'm questioning the accuracy of the source, because I know the government were keen to maintain support for the war. If people at home realise that soldiers were not being looked after, they may turn against the war effort. Overall, the source is fairly useful because it gives us information that is likely to be accurate. So what I've done here is I've picked out the information that's given in the source. I've then used my own knowledge to decide whether I think that is true. And I've said, yeah, I think that was likely because I know the conditions were bad that would have left trench foot. I've then looked at one of the nature, origin, and purpose. You don't need to look at them all. In this case, I've looked at the purpose and said it makes me question the accuracy. I've used then a bit of my knowledge to explain that. I've talked about how I know the governments were keen to maintain morale, and that shows I know a bit more contextual stuff. And then last of all, I've given an overall judgment about how useful that source is. You'd have to do this for source A and B. Okay, you don't need to compare them. You don't need to say which one is more useful. You just write 2 separate paragraphs or 1 separate paragraph, one about each source. 2 paragraphs in total. Okay, let's move on. So this question is one that is a funny little question. You will be told to study source B. Okay, this is still on the Western Front because you're still looking at the same source B. And you need to pick out something that you would follow up. Okay, in other words, something that you would like to know more about. So let's go back to source B, and I'll let you just read that. Pause and read that for a second. So there you are, there's source B. So it says the gangrene found amongst our wounded soldiers is directly due to infection introduced at the time of the wound, and is likely to occur if muddy clothing has been carried by the projectile or earth has been carried by the explosion. So if we go back to our next question, the detail in the source that you're going to go, what do you need to do there? You need to select a detail. So this will be a quote from the source if it's a written source. If it's a picture source, you need to describe something in the picture. This needs to be related to medicine. Okay, if it's describing an injury, you might want to pick on that one. Okay, so in this case, I've said the gangrene that was found amongst our wounded. I've picked out something that's medical related, and I've put that as a quote. Then you need to ask a question about that. So you in this point of this question, you're trying to find out more. Okay, you're showing to the examiner that you're an inquisitive historian who wants to find out more. So what might you want to find out more about that issue that you've identified there? So we might say, how common was it? Okay, a good question to ask for these is how common or how many. Okay, because what you can then do is provide a really good source to help you find out the information. And this can't be sort of as vague as medical records. It needs to be specific. So, for example, we might say medical records from base hospitals in Belgium and France. Okay, so then you need to explain why that source or how that source would help you answer your question. You just need to say what it will show you. What information will those sources give you? Well, it will show you the number of soldiers who suffered from gangrene. That is just a fact. It will give you the soldier, the date they've come in, and what their ailment was or what their injury was. Okay, so pretty straightforward, but also quite complicated. Once you get the knack of those, they're really easy, but they take a bit of time to get going. Okay, so then we move on from the Western Front section to question 3, which is about our medicine through time topic, the big spanning one all the way through from medieval to the modern day. And the first question is always a 4-marker and asks you to explain one way in which the treatments for illness were similar in the 14th and 17th century. So the first part of this question, explain one way in which something was either similar or it might say different, and then it will give you 2 time periods. Okay, so it asks you about, it might say surgery there, it might say prevention, it might say ideas about causes, and then it will say similar or different. You just have to compare the 2 time periods for the focus that is given to you. So I'm going to provide my similarity. My first sentence needs to provide a similarity about treatments in those 2 time periods. So I've said that bleeding was a common treatment, which it was. So I'm going to explain why that was the case, and I'd say this was because they believed in both time periods. They believed in the 4 humours and opposite theory. How do I know that? Well, I'm going to give an example from both time periods. I'm going to be specific with my knowledge from both time periods. And I'll give an example from the 14th century, and I'll say about the Black Death. Okay, and they bled as a cure in the Black Death. Similarly, so I'll use a connecting word here. I'll say similarly to show that I'm comparing. And I'll say when Charles II was ill, his surgeons bled him multiple times in a couple of days. We've looked at that. Okay, so you're given specific examples. 1 mark for identifying the similarity, 2 marks for explaining it, and then another 2 marks for developing your knowledge there and comparing. Okay, so moving on. The next question will always be an explain why. Okay, and the explain why questions can be quite broad, but you need to make sure you understand what the focus of the question is, and that it's looking for 3 paragraphs that explain why something has happened. Okay, so in this case, we're looking at the causation of change, why something has changed. So you need to identify 3 factors why something has changed during the time period that is given. Okay, so we've got here the industrial period of medicine, 1700 to 1900. We need to pick out 3 factors. So remember our factors, we're thinking about religion, government, individuals, attitudes, those sorts of things. We want to try and pick out 3 factors that would have caused change here in that period. So you'll get 2 prompts for these types of questions. I haven't given you here, but you need to include information that goes beyond that. Try to include specific knowledge in your explanation. So if you're going to mention individuals, say who those individuals are. Say the dates that they made their discoveries. Say the people who they work with. Give numbers or figures of how many people were, I don't know, vaccinated in the first 10 years or whatever. But the important thing is to focus on why and not what happened. So we're focusing on why things changed and not just describing what the changes were. Okay, so I put there a little sentence start saying this helped because, or this caused change because. Okay, so if we're talking from this perspective, I'll give you some examples in a sec of how we can phrase that. So we might say for the first paragraph here, we might talk about individuals being the drivers of change in the industrial period, such as Louis Pasteur. Okay, there's also Robert Koch, who we could talk about in that one, and we'll talk about, in terms of the specific knowledge, we can talk about his germ theory. We can provide the date of that and the date of which Robert Koch made his discoveries. And then we need to say how that led to change. And then we can say things like, well, this caused change because it was the first time that someone had published. Okay, this is the first time that someone had published an idea about germ theory and linking the 2 together with solid evidence. Okay, we're not just saying, well, it changed because people now knew about germs. That's not the case. People had known about germs for a while, but hadn't made the link. So it's the first time they'd made the link with evidence. Then we might talk about, I don't know, technology, and that the microscope had been invented and developed. And you'll say how that caused change. Well, if there wasn't for the microscope. So you might want to say, what if it wasn't there? What would it have been like? Well, maybe without the microscope, they wouldn't have been able to look more deeply into germs and into microbes and understand. And Pasteur and Koch wouldn't have been able to make the discoveries that they've made. And then we may talk about another factor, maybe government and the funding that they put into Pasteur and the sort of rivalry between the French and the German, and that led to rivalry between Pasteur and Koch. And that encourages and motivates these men to make the discoveries. Okay, so we're looking at why things happen. You may have other factors that you think you'd rather talk about there, but try and focus on the factors and then include the knowledge. Don't say one reason why was microscope, blah blah blah. Try and go with one factor was developments in technology. For example, microscope. Okay, another factor was government. For example, the French government, blah, 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 the German government, blah, blah, blah. You can provide more examples if you start with a factor than if you start with an example. You can show off your specific knowledge more. Okay? So, just to be clear for that question, just as I've been given a little bit of a clue there, you don't need an introduction. You need 3 paragraphs, 3 PEE paragraphs. PEE 3. Okay? Lovely jubbly. Number 5, okay, last question and biggest question, arguably the hardest question on the paper. And it will always give you a statement about medicine in Britain. Okay, it will give you a statement and then it will ask you how far you agree. Okay, so this is a judgment question. You're making a judgment. You have to form and weigh up an argument and make a judgment. Okay, you notice that it's 16 marks plus 4. The 4 is for SPAG, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So how do we go about answering this? I mean, we need to make sure we're agreeing and disagreeing with the source. Okay, I'll come to that bin that's appeared there at the moment. That shouldn't have appeared just yet. But we need to make sure that we're agreeing and disagreeing. We're weighing up the evidence. We're providing a balanced argument that can be lopsided. Okay, it doesn't need to be completely balanced. It can be lopsided based on your judgment and your opinion. But we do need to provide evidence for both sides. So we might open up by agreeing. It doesn't matter. You don't have to agree first. I think it's better to agree first and then disagree and then challenge the argument. But when agreeing, we could talk about Simpson, or we need to talk about Simpson. I say could. We definitely need to talk about Simpson and present the argument that is given in the question. So we need to prevent the argument that Simpson's use of chloroform had been the most important turning point, and say how it improved surgery because people weren't dying of pain shock, and they could do more complex surgery because they could be put under for longer or put asleep for longer. Okay, then we can talk about Queen Victoria and how she used chloroform, and that this increased the number of people who used chloroform, and it made it have a greater effect. But then you need to provide another paragraph or two to disagree. So you might do a paragraph or two for agree, and then we're going to look at doing a paragraph or two to disagree. Okay, so then you will probably want to question the statement here, disagree directly with the statement, and look at the limitations as chloroform and say, well, maybe it's not that much of a turning point. Okay, look at the black period in surgery where by using chloroform, people went deeper and deeper into the body because they had time to, which led to more infection. Okay, and actually the number of deaths in surgery went up after chloroform was used widely. Okay, so that suggests it isn't a turning point because things actually got worse for a little bit in surgery before they got better. Okay, and then we might provide an alternative here, an alternative argument for what might have been the most important turning point in surgery. We might say that aseptic surgery was the most important turning point. You'll notice here that there isn't a time period, so you could talk about things in the 20th century if you wanted to, things like plastic surgery, I don't know, things like x-rays, I don't know, other things that have been used to develop surgery, but don't go overboard. 4 paragraphs is more than enough. Okay, 3 you'd probably get away with if they're detailed and well evaluated. Last of all, you need to make a conclusion where you make a judgment. I like to call the last paragraph a judgment and not a conclusion, because I don't want you to necessarily summarize everything you've just said. Okay, just repeating what you said will not get you any more marks, and will probably you'll miss out on quite a few marks. You need to make a judgment on how far you agree with the source. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of ways of how to do that now. So you need to refer to criteria, things like what we say. Well, it saved more lives. Okay, it had a longer lasting impact. It was more widespread. Okay, phrases like that will relate back to significance, and will make you hit those top marks for evaluation. Okay, so how are we going to structure answers? So for agreeing, you may say things like, some may argue Simpson's use of chloroform was the most important turning point in surgery because. Okay, that's your point. Then you're going to give an example, or some examples, multiple if you've got lots, using specific names, dates, figures, all those sorts of things, and then say how it demonstrates importance. Okay, did it save lots of lives? Did it create a widespread impact? Did it create a long-term impact? Okay, referring back to significance. Then to disagree, and this is where we're challenging chloroform. We're going to talk about the limitations of chloroform. Okay, and give the examples that I talked about just a second ago, and suggest why that makes it not necessarily an important turning point. If you're talking about the black period as your example, black period of surgery where death rate went up, then you may say, well, it was slow to have an impact, or slow to have a positive impact, and actually had a negative impact to begin with. If there's your evaluation. However, if you're providing an alternative, you'll say something along these lines. However, others may argue that something else, Lister's use of aseptic surgery, for example, was more important turning point, and then you'll delve into what that was and why it was so good, and then you'll say why it will be a more important turning point. Would it have saved more lives? Okay, would surgery have got any better without this development? Okay, if we're talking about Lister's, would chloroform be, or anaesthetics be, really useful if you didn't have aseptic surgery? Okay, and then again, let me just go back to this judgment paragraph. We're calling it a conclusion, but I like to call it a judgment, because you need to make a judgment, and you need to say how far you agree. It doesn't ask you, do you agree? It asks you how far you agree. Okay, so you need to say something like completely, mostly, partially, slightly. So there is the how far bit. Choose one of those words, and then a little explanation. That last paragraph, that conclusion, can be one sentence, I feel, one or two sentences. It doesn't need to be a full paragraph. If you don't know what to write for your judgment paragraph, just write something. Okay, it's better than nothing. You'll miss out a couple of marks, or in fact, you'll gain a couple of marks just by writing that sentence at the end. Okay, even if it doesn't match with your argument, try to match it with your argument. Try to make sure that it represents what you've written in your paragraphs. But if it doesn't, it's better to write it than leave it blank. Okay, so that is all of the questions on this paper. You may think, oh, it's only 5 questions, but some of them are quite lengthy. I would go back, watch these bits over and over again, just make sure, maybe make some flashcards on each of the different question types with how to answer them. Thanks a lot, guys. See you later.